Buongiorno, anzi buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the Chamber of Deputies. I shall be trying to speak slowly so I can facilitate translation. Special thanks to all the speakers. Anne Brasseur, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. She's also a dear friend. She's often here visiting us at the Chamber of Deputies. And I also want to greet Marcin Beletsky, who's head of the Department on Democratization of the OSCE. I also wish to thank and greet Ferdinand Melin-Sucramagnin, deontologist of the French National Assembly, nominized and visiting fellow of the Brookings Institute. I also want to greet Raffaele Cantone, President of the National Anti-Corruption Authority, Vittorio Alvino, President of Open Police, Michele Nicoletti, who is the head of the Italian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and Antonio Polito, who is deputy editor of the Corriere della Sera, who will be moderating our discussion. And of course, I wish to greet colleagues or members of Parliament, authorities, and all those who've responded to our invitation. This meeting focuses on an issue which I consider to be crucial for all democratic countries. How to ensure that members of Parliament truly base their conduct on principles of honesty, independence, and transparency in exercising their functions. The presidency of the Chamber of Deputies has decided to organize this discussion together with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe because this is the very institution which in recent years has undertaken initiatives and which has taken very clear positions and which has shaped recommendations to member countries for greater commitment in combating corruption, also by adopting codes of conduct for members of Parliament. And this is the specific issue our meeting focuses on today. Now, why do I consider this issue so important? Because we're living in a period of history in which there's a growing feeling of distance and distrust of citizens with regard to institutions, both with regard to national and European institutions. And I believe that this kind of feeling is corrosive for the firmness of our democracies. This feeling of distrust, therefore, is corrosive. We voted in Italy at regional elections in Italy, and only slightly more than 50% of people entitled to vote actually cast their votes. This is something which I find very concerning, and I believe that this requires a more thorough analysis than we are currently undertaking. Nearly half of potential electors decided to abstain. 70 years have elapsed since the end of World War II and from liberation from fascism and Nazism. 70 years ago, European citizens returned to know and practice civil liberties and also political liberties. This Parliament had representatives who hadn't been elected by the people. But experience teaches us that freedom and democracy are not given once and for all, because they are continually challenged and jeopardized. And the risk today is represented by this distance between citizens and institutions, which therefore must be narrowed. I believe this should be the top priority of all institutions, to work to narrow this gap. And in order to do this, institutions and parties need to renew themselves. They need to make themselves transparent and also morally unimpeachable. Morally unimpeachable. And this lack of confidence has also been fueled by the fact that politicians and parliamentarians have committed crimes and have also committed unconscionable acts. And this is the origin of a lot of the distrust which we see throughout the country today. There's one more thing which I feel I need to say, something which I always repeat. We must not generalize. We must not, and this applies to every profession, must not say that all politicians are the same. This would be another big mistake, because I must say that for the last 2.5 years here, I must say the great majority of members of parliament carry out their tasks with competence, with discipline and with honor, as our constitution tells us. So we must, in this case, also be very prudent. Generalization is the tomb of truth, it is said. And politics is the mirror of our society. If there's corruption in politics, there's a problem of corruption in our societies. This it's not an excuse for anything, but it makes the situation even more worrying, because if there is someone corrupt, there's someone who is willing to corrupt them. The fact that inside this institution there are people, and I said the great majority, who perform their functions with honor and with great discipline. It's also shown in the fact that proposals to amend regulation in order to introduce an ethics code, a code of ethics for members of parliament, is something which has been supported by dozens of members of parliament. There's been cross-party support for it, and this shows great sensitivity and the will to provide practical answers to the demand for good politics. Corruption is the evil which is most damaging to our democracies, because it casts discredit on our leaders in politics and also in our economy, and also casts bad light on the reputation of an entire country, and discourages investments. And we know that dirty money ejects clean money, and also because there's a material cost for the whole of the community. And in the country of Italy, this is estimated as amounting to dozens of billions of euros every year. In recent times, however, the Italian Parliament has not just stood without reacting. It's taken a number of measures to combat this problem. And if I look back a couple of years, perhaps a bit more, 2.5 years, I'm referring to the 2012 law, which was presented by Paolo Severino, at that time Minister of Justice, which established a prohibition on candidature and a ban on holding elective positions and government positions for those who had been sentenced for crimes involving conspiracy against public administration. And there's 5 extra laws to punish corruption on our law book too, and there's also a law which was approved recently before the regional elections, with harsher penalties for corruption and reforming accounting crimes, which is something which has actually been repealed as a crime by the previous government. And I'm also referring to the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Authority. So this Parliament has certainly taken action on these issues. These are important actions because they aim at giving clearer references to police and the judiciary, which are called upon to repress these crimes. But good laws are not enough. This is often something which we often repeat. It's not enough to have good results, and law enforcement is also not enough. And a lot has to be done in terms of prevention, and we also need to be far-sighted. I'm thinking of the very delicate issue of the funding of political activity. Direct public funding of parties is something which has been abolished, as you may know. Only private funding is now allowed. All right, this is something which we can only acknowledge. This is the respect which is due to any parliamentary decision, but there is a concern which I would express, because in the lack of adequate measures, we truly face the risk of greater and increasing conditioning of politics on the part of private interests. This is almost self-evident. And this would not only take to worrying forms of pollution of the atmosphere of politics, but would also lead to a loss for politics and the institutions, which have to have at their heart and the general interests of the country and the general community, rather than the interests of vested interests of small communities of people. And I think this is something which has to be one of the areas we need to discuss. And it's no coincidence that democracies which have written codes of conduct for members of parliament are the ones where the state only finances a tiny portion of political activity. I think this is not a coincidence, and therefore it becomes urgent, in fact, not just necessary, for Italy to regulate lobbying. Because lobbying is something which is still unregulated in Italy, whereas it is in many countries and certainly at the European Parliament. So I believe that on this point we are certainly behind developments elsewhere, and we need to make up for this delay. I know that the number of bills and suggestions to amend regulations which are being presented in both chambers of Parliament, and discussion is currently underway in the Constitutional Affairs Committee in the Senate, and this in addition to the adoption of a basic text where it's obvious that work needs to be continued. And there I believe that all the political parties, both in the government and in opposition, need to work to ensure that during this term of Parliament a balanced and strict regulatory framework on the activity of lobbying groups be approved, and that it be established that there has to be a form of regulation based on the principles of discipline and transparency, and the avoidance of self-interest. So it is important in this Parliament to adopt a statute on lobbying. And there are two articles in our Constitution, 54 and 67, which need to be addressed. You may know that Article 54 says those called upon to exercise a public function have to do this with discipline and honour. And Article 67 states that members of Parliament must exercise their functions without any restriction on their mandate, which means that they need to act in absolute independence, in total independence from any outside conditioning. And these same principles are the ones which inspired the proposals presented here in Parliament by Mr. Nicoletti and Ms. Binetti, aimed at introducing a code of ethics and a code of conduct for members of Parliament. These proposals, which will certainly need to be scrutinized by the relevant parliamentary committee, aim at ensuring transparency and accountability in financial activities undertaken by members of Parliament and removing any situations of conflict of interest. My intention is to invite all political groups to take this requirement on board. No one can fail to see how important, how a signal of rigorousness it would be if before the end of this Parliament we could enact the law on lobbying and also a code of ethics for member of parliaments. That would show consistency with what we've done so far and a real commitment on the part of this Parliament to open a new page. The so-called anti-politics has to be responded to with real facts, and the demand for good politics is something which cannot be met by demagoguery, rhetoric, but we need to shoulder our responsibilities going beyond the hesitant reactions there have been so far. We need to give clear and unambiguous signs of responsibility. These two things, the Lobbying Act and the Code of Ethics for Members of Parliament, are two very clear signals. And I think this is the most important path to regain support on the part of public opinion, also to restore to politics and democratic institutions an image of cleanliness, an image of uprightness, an image of moral rigor which people demand of us. This is a way not to disappoint people and to turn a page, and I hope this Parliament will be able to do this. Thank you.
Allora, io ringrazio molto.
I'd like to thank President Boldrini for the great clarity of her presentation and for having addressed this issue so effectively. I thank you for having been moderating this meeting. And two brief words on this meeting, which is aimed at comparing international experiences, which is very important because the issue which we're dealing with is common to politics throughout the world, and so many American films. You will have seen people asking whether you would buy a used car from a candidate, because this is the basic issue. Can I have confidence in the person who I'm delegating my political representation to, and therefore the representation of my interests to? In our conversation, I think we need to bear in mind the backdrop. In Italy, we have a lot of work to combat corruption, also through police activity and a judicial activity which is very intense in this area, but preventative action upstream, an attempt to reform the system, which perhaps is falls short of the best practices we have in the world. So let's listen to the Anne Brasseur, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, who's a member of the Parliament of Luxembourg and the political groups in the European Parliament. Sorry, the Assembly of the Council of Europe, just to slipped.
Però scusi, no, però nell'ALDE.
But ALDE is the European Parliament, no? You're part of ALDE. I'm president of the whole of the Assembly of the Council of Europe, so I'm not here as a liberal or a member of another group. I'm above sides here. President, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin my statement in the language of the country which is hosting us today, and to thank in particular President Boldrini for her invitation to be part of this very important event. Dear President, it is a true honor for me to be here and to open this conference together with you on codes of conduct for members of parliament. When I was elected President of the Parliamentary Assembly, I in fact did indicate combating corruption and promoting integrity in public life as a priority in my term. And I'm very glad to make a contribution and provide my support for your initiative. And now, if you allow, I would like to continue my presentation in English. It's easier for me, and I think it's better for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe has on numerous occasions recognized integrity of public officials, including members of parliament, as a fundamental prerequisite for a reliable and efficient public administration and a key element for public trust in political institutions. As elected members of a parliament, we have to serve as a role model. So we have to be above all norms. Norms are just a minimum, but we have really to serve as a role model. Among the legal instruments adopted by the Council of Europe in this regard is the recommendation on codes of conduct for public officials, by which the Committee of Ministers recommended member states to promote the adoption of national codes of conduct for public officials based on the model which is annexed in the recommendation. And I have it here for those who are not aware of this important annex. Codes of conduct for parliamentarians, in particular, are a main pillar of a national integrity system, given the primary role of parliamentarians in promoting transparency and honesty in the public life. The existence of such a code and the effectiveness of its provisions are at the core of the fourth evaluation round of the GRECO, which is the Group of States Against Corruption. The Council of Europe body who monitors the compliance with anti-corruption standards by carrying out evaluation procedures in respect of each of its member states. Current GRECO 4 evaluation round, for example, deals also with corruption prevention in respect of members of parliaments. Italy has not been yet evaluated by GRECO in the framework of this round, and the adoption of a code of conduct for parliamentarians is very welcomed and timely in the light of the forthcoming evaluation. It is important for Italy to have this now in order to face this GRECO evaluation. The inclusion of standards of ethical principles in a binding code of conduct would be emblematic of a crucial evolution of the Parliament's stance on integrity matters. But this code shall not only codify the ethical principles and rules of conduct applicable to parliamentarians, but needs also to create a mechanism meant to ensure that ethical breaches are tackled and that information on them is made public. There must be whole transparency. Let me inform you that the Parliamentary Assembly, which I have the honor to represent here today, has also played its part in the process. In 2012, we have in fact adopted our own code of conduct. And I'm glad to say this in the presence of my predecessor, Mr. Jean-Claude Mignon, who is present here today. Since then, the Assembly has continued its work in tackling new threats to the rule of law and new forms of corruption, also within the recently created parliamentary anti-corruption platform, a space for dialogue and cooperation between parliamentarians and on how to deal with all forms of abuse, briberies, and corruption. To give you one recent example of the activities of this platform, in April last, our members had a fruitful discussion with Mr. Raffaele Cantone, who is the president of the Italian Anti-Corruption Authority. And the discussion was on corrupt elites as a threat to democracy. And I'm really pleased to see him here again today. Buongiorno, Presidente, è un vero piacere per me rivederla qui a Roma.
It really is a great pleasure to be here in Rome, so I welcome you most warmly.
Who is also the president of the Italian delegation. And I would like to thank you for all what you're doing and your personal dedication, not only to this matter, but also to the other work of the Council of Europe. But you are the rapporteur on corruption as a governance regime, a barrier to institutional efficiency and progress. And there we will develop the Assembly's further contribution to fight against corruption. Because corruption, and we have to fight against corruption together, corruption is undermining our democratic systems. So as elected members, we have a huge responsibility. A code of conduct is important because it's in order to raise awareness, but it's not enough. What is the most important is decency. Either you have decency or you don't. And unfortunately, there are a lot of persons who don't have it, and amongst them also politicians. But that's why we have to, in those cases where there is no decency, we have to say no, and we have to have zero tolerance against colleagues who are cheating, because they are not only getting rich by doing such things, but they are destroying our democratic system. And that is not acceptable for any of us. So let's stick together to fight corruption, and let's start with our own house, that is in our national parliaments. Cari colleghi presidenti, il codice di condotta.
Colleagues, presidents, a code of professional ethics for parliamentarians is often not sufficient as a way of bringing corruption to an end completely, but it can be a first and important step toward greater transparency. And now I would like to close my speech by assuring you, Madam Speaker, Madam President, that the Council of Europe as a whole and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in particular will continue to extend full support to the efforts that you're making, to the initiatives that you are deploying with a view to the ending corruption.
In politics. Thank you very much. Mille grazie.
Thank you once again.
Grazie al Presidente Brasseur che è stata molto.
Thank you very much, President Brasseur. You were certainly very fervent and enthusiastic, and we appreciate that. And I'd now like to invite Mr. Marcin Walecki, who is chief of the Demographic Governance Unit in the OSCE. He's Polish, of course, but he has worked on democratic governance in many countries in Europe, so he's going to share his experience with us, experience that he's had in various countries, and I think he's going to be talking in particular to work with the media, because a professional code of ethics is something that can help to improve relations with the media as well. But you have the floor, Mr. Walecki.
Madam President Baldini, Madam President Verso, President Cantone, honorable members of parliament, it is a great honor and great privilege to address you today. I've been told that the moderator is very strict and I have strictly 15 minutes. The copy of my presentation will be made available. My understanding is that it has been translated into Italian, and what I will try to do over the next 15 minutes is to share both the main findings of our study, which we did as an OSCE ODIHR, and some of my personal experience, personal stories, working on the issue of political corruption for almost 15 years in 40 countries. And I totally agree with what was said before for a strong call when it comes to the issue of political corruption. I had a privilege to be a Greco evaluator of Italy for the third round on funding of political parties. And indeed, some of my presentation will be dealing with upcoming Greco evaluation. And we at ODIHR, and I think all of us working on these issues, certainly find corruption, political corruption, to be one of the major challenges to equality of democracy in 21st century. Very briefly, when it comes to ODIHR, most of you probably know us through our work on election observation, but we are the key regional human rights institution helping OSCE participating states in implementing their human dimension commitments. We started to work on the issue of parliamentary ethics a few years ago, just before Greco started looking at the fourth round of evaluation. We produced a study. It is on our website. It is available in 3 languages. I'm not going to go into all the details. I will focus on some elements. But what is also very important is that over the last few years, we've been working with few parliaments, including Sweden, Estonia. We're currently working with 5 other parliaments, helping them to draft their codes of conduct. And let me start with giving you overall regional picture. Many of those things which apply to OSCE apply to a Council of Europe, because participating states of OSCE, all of them are member states of the Council of Europe. I have to tell you, working in more than 40 countries, the trend is very negative. The picture is very worrying. I would argue that a social credit is running out. When it comes to perception of politicians, perception of parliaments and political parties, you will notice that Transparency International for the last 10 years been rating political parties and parliaments as the most corrupt democratic institutions. If you look at the level of trust in parliaments, it's also worrying. We have a very clear decline in trust in parliaments. From 2007 to 2012, the trust in parliaments dropped from 57% to 31%. Regionally, turnout in elections dropped by almost 12%. Only 16% of our citizens trust political parties. So I would argue the social credit is really running out. If you look at and I would really like to congratulate my colleagues from the Council of Europe, the work which is done by Greco is the most independent, the most constructive evaluation mechanism which we have right now, done in a very professional peer-to-peer review mechanism. And as someone who had a privilege to help Italy with recommendations on the issue of funding of political parties, I would say that the third round is very closely connected with the issue of the fourth round, upcoming round of evaluation. What I will do in my presentation, I will very quickly go through some key points which we found in our publication and some key points which are already visible from Greco reports. So far we have 26 Greco reports. We have our own study which look at 18 codes of conduct in OSCE participating states. We have a number of compliance reports. So we have some data which I think you can find in terms of reforming your own regime. But just putting things in a regional perspective. Number of countries started to regulate the issue of parliamentary conduct, started to introduce ethical regimes. The first attempts were done, of course, in UK Parliament already in 1695. Then my dear colleague, Norma Nason, is going to mention the US experience. Indeed, it was one of the first Western democracies to start regulating this issue in more details. But we see a clear trend. More and more countries are now adopting similar regimes, ethics regimes. Norway and Sweden adopted their codes last year. Estonia, Montenegro also adopted codes last year. European Parliament adopted a code in 2011. And there are 8 other Council of Europe, OSCE, member states, participating states who are currently adopting, finalizing their codes of conduct. So we have a clear trend towards introducing those ethics regimes regulating the issue of parliamentary behavior. As my time is limited, I would really stick to key messages. The first one is a fundamental issue: why introducing ethical standards and codes of conduct. And I agree with Madam President, it's not just an issue of a moralization of moral aspects. It really pays off. It helps, first of all, parliamentarians to send a clear message to media, to citizens, that they take their behavior seriously, that the politics is professionalizing. It also is a matter of legitimacy accountability, to set up a clear standards on which we can judge politicians and their behaviors. Very important. It really helps media to apply certain standards of how to evaluate the behavior of politicians. It also is a very effective tool to prevent and fight corruption. And finally, I would argue, keeping in mind this global context which I just gave you, it is very important to recognize that we have certain standards, international standards and standards of how our democracies should reform itself and how should they change. So there are a number of, I would group them into 4 key pillars of why we need standards and codes of conduct. I don't have enough time to go into all 6 aspects, but very briefly, I would like to focus on key elements of codes of conduct, and we've actually seen it in a number of Greco recommendations coming from already 26 reports, that more or less you can group them into 5 key areas where the codes of conduct should go and what they should regulate. Starting with the conflict of interest, a very important issue. I would argue that when it comes to the work of parliamentarians, they probably have one of the most difficult public offices, because they have a multiple possibilities for conflict of interest. They can have a conflict of interest with family, personal relations, with their professions, with other public functions which they are performing. So number of recommendations, number of good practices which we've seen in this area. You could actually group them into 3 major approaches. Banning MPs from taking certain roles through laws on incompatibility or conflict of interest, allowing MPs to hold certain interest, but require them to disclose in details through the registries of interest, and intermediate approach, prohibiting some interest but allowing others. We don't have enough time to go into details, but in our publication we go into different mechanisms used by different states. Another very important issue is the issue of assets declarations. Again, this is where we actually see a number of participating states applying mechanisms for assets declarations for MPs. 2 key messages. I would argue that a good practice is to make the assets declaration mechanism available online, real life, to increase maximum transparency, to allow citizens, media, to access the information real time. Another very important aspect, I'll go back to that, is the issue of monitoring and enforcement. Most of the Greco recommendations and the case studies which we analyzed point out that the weakest link is lack of proper monitoring and proper enforcement. Allowances, expenses, and parliamentary resources. This is where most of the scandals happened recently in Europe. I don't want to go into what happened in the UK, but we had a similar scandals in Poland last year. It is really an issue of abuse of parliamentary resources, especially in those countries where parliamentarians are allowed to use parliamentary resources for their local offices, for their staff, for their travel, for the research. This issue needs to be regulated, needs to be monitored properly. Relations with lobbyists was mentioned earlier. Certainly, number of recommendations coming from Greco, number of recommendations coming from our own research, our study. You can actually see an example of a very recent recommendation for Germany, for Bundestag, where Greco was recommending improving transparency when it comes to dealings with lobbyists. A very interesting recommendation was also proposed to UK to go beyond just regulating relations with lobbyists for members of parliament, but also making sure that members, their staff, parliamentary staff, is also accountable for their interactions with lobbyists. The weakest point. I've looked at most of the Greco reports, and I would argue that the weakest point is monitoring and enforcement. Greco recommended to a majority of countries to strengthen the mechanisms for supervision and enforcement of the rules of conduct. I would argue that when it comes to monitoring and enforcement, it's a three-steps process. Those are the issues which we really need to design to have an effective monitoring. There needs to be a system for complaints, up to discussion, who can complain, how. Are we limiting only to members of parliament complaining about other members of parliament? Are we also allowing media and citizens to complain for a discussion? But you need to have a mechanism for complaints. You need to have a mechanism for investigation, and you need to have a dissuasive proportionate sanctions. Different experience of 18 countries we will look at. You can have three approaches how to deal with compliance. You can have a self-regulatory model. You can have a co-regulatory model. The Parliament is still in charge of investigating, but there is an external commissioner who brings complaints, who evaluates complaints. I don't want to go into a French model. I think this is a very interesting model, and I'm really happy to see the first commissioner who is actually responsible for the French model. So I don't want to go into a French example. An interesting example is also US, which went through some reforms over the last decade of actually taking the system outside the hands of representatives and placing it in the hands of external regulator. Issue which I would really like to emphasize is when you are designing your ethics regime, your code of conduct, there are going to be a number of issues which you will have to look at. And in my opinion, one of the most challenging one would be a balance, finding a balance between private life, immunity, and parliamentary ethical behavior. Finding a thin line, because in the end of the day, you don't want to overregulate, especially when it comes to private life, personal behavior. But you need to recognize that private matters can occasionally damage the reputation of the parliament. The private behavior of members of parliament outside the chamber, when they participate in TV debates, TV programs, their behavior is perceived by voters as a parliamentary behavior. There are many examples. I don't want to go into all the details, but I would ask for caution when it comes to the issue of regulating private life, also undermining the issue of immunity. Finally, I would wrap up my conclusion. So what are the lessons learned from our study for some of the Greco reports? The codes of conduct are very helpful when it comes to establishing common values. They are helpful in terms of setting acceptable rules on which we could judge political behavior. They encourage monitoring, peer-to-peer, but also monitoring by independent media. They are helpful when it comes to sanctioning really unacceptable behavior and eliminating those parliamentarians who are bringing, who actually the reputation of the parliament is suffering because of their behavior. But there are also lessons learned how to design a good system. The first lesson, and it was mentioned by Madam President Boldini this morning in an earlier presentation, it's really trying to aim at building a consensus. You cannot impose a code of conduct on MPs. It needs to result from a consensus coming from all the major parliamentary groups, all the major fractions. And I would encourage you to work in the spirit of consensus. It needs to be developed, adopted, and kept up to date by MPs themselves. You cannot have any external experts coming and drafting it to you. It needs to be your own system based on your political, legal culture. Peers monitoring each other, a very effective mechanism, making sure that actually MPs cooperate when it comes to monitoring. And very important measure, it needs to be supported by some practical documents. Documents which can be used by journalists, can be used by citizens in terms of evaluating parliamentary behavior. And I will finish by arguing it's a process. It's an ongoing process. You need to have a mechanism for evaluating your system. You need to have a mechanism for discussing new challenges. You need to have a mechanism for advising and training new MPs who are coming to the Parliament. It's a very important component to make sure that new parliamentarians are also trained and are properly explained how to act and how to comply. So I would say, once you start it, it will be with you for the rest of your political life. I will stop by congratulating organizers. This is a very important initiative, and on behalf of our COD, I would like to thank Madam President, thank Council of Europe, and we are to your disposal. Our expertise can certainly help you, and we will be glad to continue cooperating with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Grazie, Mr. Valinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Valetsky. And now I'll give the floor to Ferdinand Melin-Sukromanian, who is professor in public law and also constitutionalist and consultant of the Constitution Council of France, but he's here in particular as deontologist of the French National Assembly, which is a position which we don't know here, kind of confessor or psychologist of, doesn't just monitor them, helps them not to sin, perhaps.
Merci.
Thank you very much, sir. Excuse me, I'm going to be speaking in French. I don't speak English or Italian very well. So thank you very much indeed, Madam President, for the invitation. I'm extremely pleased to be here with the Italian Parliament on this occasion and to be able to exchange views with you and to learn. I mean, I'm here first and foremost to learn. Given that the time allotted to me is very short, 15 minutes, maybe I'll use even a bit less. But in that short period of time, I would like to share something about the French experience on professional ethics or parliamentary deontology with you. And then, of course, I understand that there will be a Q&A session, and I'll be pleased to field any questions you may have, or to answer, or to hear out your comments. Jean Jaurès, a French parliamentarian, when he wanted to define the Republic, he was trying in 1903 in a speech to children, he was trying to define the Republic, and he said that the Republic is an act of trust. Now, in a number of countries, perhaps that's true of Italy as well, but in France today, that trust, that relationship of confidence between the public and elected officials is at its nadir. We have seen the results of surveys. About 80% of the French no longer trust the political class. So for the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a tremendous increase in that distrust, and one of the reactions that French politicians have decided on is trying to become more ethical or to show themselves to be more ethical through deontology codes, what have you. So it really has become a fashionable thing. Insofar as I'm concerned, and I think that it's true that we are at a turning point here. A number of mechanisms have been put in place. I'll talk to you about one of them in just a moment. They've been put in place. They're not perfect, but they do exist. Some of them can no doubt be improved, including the one that I myself represent. They can no doubt be improved, but you know, when someone has a high temperature, well, it's like we have a very high temperature in our parliamentary ethics, and that can mean one of two things. Either that the patient is about to die, or that the fever is going very shortly to calm down and the temperature to come down. Now, I'm convinced we're in the second scenario, but to make sure that we are in the second scenario, as Madame Brasseur has said, and the previous speakers as well, we have to be resolute and determined in our efforts if we want to make sure that we don't end up in the first scenario. So, time is flying by, so let me just say a few words about this institution of a French National Assembly deontologist. The institution was created by a decision of the Bureau of the National Assembly, the lower house of the French Parliament, taken on 6 April 2011. I mean, that was based on a Greco recommendation, on a deliberate will of the political class, on the clamoring of public opinion, and the idea was to set up a mechanism that would verify the ethics of parliamentarians. Similar proposals that were made for members of government and for senior civil servants. Of course, the whole spectrum of important decision makers should be covered. In the National Assembly, this resulted very quickly in a decision to draft a professional ethics code. It's still the same as back in 2011. But I have made some proposals for amendment that have been submitted to the Bureau of the National Assembly, and I hope that they will be adopted next week. So that will change the code to some extent. But it's a very simple one in 6 points. 6 main guiding principles are set out. And in particular, it was decided to endow the code with a controlling mechanism in the form of a deontologist. The idea was that the National Assembly would choose an individual. You have a similar system in the province of Quebec with the Ethics Commissioner. It's the same sort of situation in many countries. In the Senate, for instance, it was decided to entrust this to a collegial body consisting of senators. It exists, but it's not terribly active, or has not been up to now. In the National Assembly, it was decided rather to entrust this function to an individual coming in from the outside. I mean, that might seem a bit curious. The transplant may seem be difficult. The first deontologist was a professor of law. The first was a professor of law. The second was a legal expert, former minister, member of the Constitutional Court, and the third, in just 3.5 years, is me, a professor of law from the outside of the institution, not a member of any political party, with no political legitimacy. So it might seem that it would be difficult to transplant the one on the other, but it would seem that it is taking, that the transplanted organ is taking, and compared to the activity of my predecessors, because I've looked at their reports, of course, and I'm preparing my own first report, there's a very significant increase in activity. In a year, I have met, either at my request or at their request, I have met 124 parliamentarians on the use of their parliamentary indemnities, exercise of other professions, such as the profession of lawyer while in Parliament, and various other issues like that. And that is about twice the number of people my predecessors met. And I think that this is due to the fact that the institution is starting to be known. People are starting to be interested in avoiding conflict of interest. So having this deontologist coming in from the outside, I mean, the appointment is not so easy because 60% of the members of the Bureau have to approve the nomination, but the professional duties of the deontologist consist in consultations in order to avoid conflict of interest, but then there are a number of sort of classical things. For instance, declarations of trips, especially when the trip is being funded by a third party, such as a private company or a foreign government, a declaration concerning any gift or benefit received of a value of more than 150 euros. Yes. You can always turn it down, is the first answer, of course, unless it is sort of an integral part of a parliamentary diplomacy, in which case it may be absolutely necessary. Sometimes they accept it and they give this to the deontologist. The deontologist doesn't take advantage of it. He puts it in a safe and inscribes a date on it, on the gift. So all of this mechanism is supplemented by a series of measures that seek to improve and strengthen transparency, which accompany sort of this internal mechanism within the National Assembly vis-à-vis the outside world. And one of the advantages of this code in the National Assembly is that elsewhere things have changed a lot. In particular, the National Assembly has endowed itself with a deontologist, but together with a number of measures to be more transparent about its work program, about its budget, about with things. The budget, for instance, is in open data on the internet. There's information about the parliamentarians that is easily available. And at the same time, a special authority for ensuring transparency of public life, which is more or less equivalent to what Mr. Cantone runs here in Italy, which is a body that calls on parliamentarians, members of the government, and senior civil servants to declare their activities in an open manner in order to make it verifiable that they are not involved in any conflict of interest. And this, of course, incites parliamentarians to put ethical questions to themselves. I mean, when they're filling in their declaration of interest form, they have to ask themselves, oh, well, yes, I'm paying my spouse and my son a salary as assistants. In ethical terms, is this fully in line with the principles set out in the code or by the high transparency authority? And the fact that the authority exists with some sanctioning powers has contributed a lot to the rooting of a culture of ethics. I think one has to think of it in terms of culture of ethics. But there's one issue that was raised by Mr. Walewski, namely the issue of declaration of assets. Well, there is an obligation to declare assets from the authority, but the authority has not provided for that to be in open data on the internet, but rather that it would be submitted to this high authority and then verified by the tax authorities. I mean, this with a view to respecting the private lives of politicians. So yes, transparency, but private life needs to be protected. And that is no doubt the borderline where there are the most difficulties. I mean, opening up these declarations with access to the public, perhaps that would be going too far. There should be some limitations on transparency for it to function well. And what is important in these declaration of assets is that it be possible to check the change in total assets over a term of office of an individual. But it seems to me that the citizen does not really need to know or has no interest in knowing that politician X is poor at the beginning of his term of office or rich at the beginning of his term of office for this or that reason. But of course it is important to check to what extent his or her total assets have changed over a term of office, but that can be done without putting the information into the public domain. Yes, I can see that I'm coming to the end of my allotted time limit, so to close off in just a sentence or two, institutions like an ethics commissioner or a deontologist, that is to say institutions that are in-house, even if the work is done by an external person, such as me in France, these institutions do function. I'm a professor of law. I came into the National Assembly with some very negative prejudices about soft law and the rules of soft law, which at best result in some disciplinary sanctions. So I came in with a very negative attitude, but after a year I have realized that this is extremely useful and that parliamentarians themselves want advice. They want to be preventive, prophylactic. They want to avoid conflict of interest. So the institution is responding to a need, this is not a link in the chain that whose importance should be exaggerated. I mean, just having a deontologist or an ethics commissioner within a parliament is not necessarily something that is going in and of itself fully to resolve the problem. But it is, I think, a useful link in the chain, and I don't think that one should take the luxury of not having it. But it needs to be combined with other levels. We have in France, for instance, an independent authority that is entrusted with combating corruption. But having a deontologist or an ethics expert or what have you is, I think, a useful thing. And if you want to do something similar in Italy, I'm pleased to answer any questions you may have or to respond to your comments. Thank you for your attention.
Beh, grazie. Devo dire
Many thanks. I must say that was a very interesting analysis, full of hints for us to learn. I'd like to introduce Norman Eisen, who is currently visiting professor at Brookings University, but he was ambassador of the United States to the Czech Republic and the ethics czar of the Obama administration for a 2-year special assistant to the president on these issues. So another success story, I think, to be told. Norman.
Grazie. Signora Presidente Boldrini,
Madam President Boldrini, distinguished members of Parliament.
guests, buon pomeriggio. Thanks for inviting me to join this urgent discussion in this beautiful and ancient city to which we Americans owe so many elements of our Republican system of self-government. And in my town of Washington, D.C., we also borrowed a lot of your architecture, so we owe you for that as well. In exchange for all that, as a little form of repayment, I would like to offer some perspectives from the United States on best practices in codes of conduct for government officials to complement the view of my colleagues on the panel. Since we are today in the Chamber of Deputies, the equivalent of our United States Congress House of Representatives, I will emphasize the best practices of that body in my country based on years of my professional life. As you can see from my gray beard, perhaps too many years, spent addressing violations, alleged violations and actual ones of the House of Representatives codes of conduct, including in my role as a private attorney and as the co-founder of a government watchdog group. In addition to the code of conduct of our House, I think there are also some interesting and important lessons to be drawn from the new and innovative code of conduct for White House officials, which we established in 2009, whereas I worked as the so-called ethics czar for President Obama. At his direction, I wrote our new code, the Obama Ethics Pledge, and although I'm biased, I think it has been effective. So far, knock on wood, there have been no major White House scandals. The political scientists who study these things say that is the longest scandal-free White House run in modern presidential history. I'll accept congratulations on January 20th of next 18 months from now. But I will talk about the lessons of that code of conduct a little bit as well. I should add that my reflections are those of a friend and a partner nation with Italy who has plenty of challenges and problems and difficulties of our own. Having spent almost 25 years working on these issues, I approach them with a degree of genuine humility in sharing our successes and our failures. So, What is the U.S. view of best practices for what should be in government codes of ethics, codes of conduct? In the United States, and I dare say internationally, there is a pretty well-developed set of best practices, and Marcin and Ferdinand touched on many of them. In our House of Representatives in the United States Congress, for example, Rule 23 is the Code of Official Conduct. It provides rules in 4 core areas. 1, rules for regulating conflicts of interest, that is, situations where personal interests or financial holdings conflict or may appear to conflict with official parliamentary duties. 2, for gifts, which are really a special case of conflicts, for gifts, particularly those from lobbyists and other persons interested in parliamentary decisions. 3, for outside employment of parliamentarians before, during, and after government service, particularly with lobbyists or lobbying firms, a situation we call in the U.S. the revolving door. The revolving door, again, it's a particular kind of conflict of interest. And 4, there are rules about parliamentarians' proper use of official resources, staff, budget, travel, and the like. So, there is much more in our House Code of Conduct, Rule 23, that I'm using as an example, and there's a lot of detail, but those 4 items, conflicts, gifts, employment, and resources, are the core. These same 4 key areas are also at the center of our codes of conduct for employees of our executive branch, as codified in statutes and regulations, as well as in the Obama Ethics Pledge. I emphasize these 4 key items because, having drafted one code of conduct and often having delved into other codes of conduct, both in the United States and when I served as U.S. ambassador in Prague, Czech Republic, dealing with the European issues, I sometimes find that when I am working on these issues, I lose the forest for the trees, that the priorities get lost for me in all of the detail. So I try to keep those 4 core items always in mind, although I should add that the content of any code must be particularized for the circumstances of the particular government, of the government body, of the jurisdiction, and so forth. So our U.S. code that I'm citing to, the House Code of Conduct, is 5 pages long, elaborating on those 4 key principles. And the House Ethics Manual of Official Guidance for those 5 pages with those 4 principles is 456 pages long. Our Obama Ethics Pledge, I'm proud to say, we got onto 1 page, and we made everybody sign that in the Obama administration so they knew what they were getting into. To be fair, we could do that because we built on and added to other rules which already existed, and we did have several pages of definitions that were attached to that 1 page that everyone signed. So that's what goes in codes of conduct. But a good code is only the beginning, as you've heard from my colleagues. Because in our U.S. experience, just as important as the code, maybe even more important, is its enforcement. And here I want to very briefly share some lessons drawn from U.S. challenges and problems in recent years in our parliament and how we responded. And I'm going to add 2 more items to our small checklist in this portion, concluding portion of my remarks. I'm going to add enforcement and transparency, and those 2 go together. They're joined. Even with our parliamentary code of conduct in the United States, our enforcement has sometimes lagged. That is in part because under our Constitution, the ultimate enforcers are the parliamentarians themselves. And understandably, they can at times be reluctant to sanction their colleagues and their friends. It's human nature. For example, from 1997 to 2004, there was a 7-year truce in enforcement in filing complaints in the House of Representatives. Each of the two major parties had agreed quietly not to file complaints against the other. The government watchdog group that I co-founded helped end that in 2004 by writing a complaint together with a brave parliamentarian, a little lonely, but very brave, who was willing to file it with the House Ethics Committee, the enforcement authority. And the resulting investigation produced the discipline of the member investigated and ultimately helped cause the party that was in control to lose their control of the House of Representatives, with the other party taking charge. Out of all of that came a new enforcement tool in 2008 in our House of Representatives, and one that I would recommend: the creation of an independent entity, the Office of Congressional Ethics, or OCE, a nonpartisan fact-finding body that investigates allegations from any source, including whistleblowers. Whistleblowers have a very, very important part in the U.S. system, and they might otherwise be afraid to step forward if there wasn't a body like the OCE. The Office of Congressional Ethics then recommends actions to the parliamentarian who, under the Constitution, maintain the ultimate decision-making power, and here comes the transparency point, the OCE referrals become public, allowing the press, the civil society groups, the NGOs, and ultimately the people to hold elected officials accountable. As a result, since the creation of the OCE for our House in 2008, there have been a larger number of investigations in that parliamentary body than in our Senate. About 46 OCE referrals and about 20 House Ethics Committee disciplinary actions versus just 4 letters of admonishment on the part of the Senate. Now, to be fair, the U.S. Senate is a smaller body, but it's not that much smaller. That last aspect of OCE enforcement, transparency, and the accountability it brings is the 6th and final point I want to emphasize. In our U.S. parliamentary ethics system, we have many transparency mechanisms. Some analogs were discussed: asset disclosures that our parliamentarians file, disclosures, robust disclosures that lobbyists must make about their activities, information in campaign finance filing, and much, much more. But to explain the value of transparency, I would like to close by turning to one of our Obama White House ethics transparency innovation. By the way, Ferdinand, we put everybody's financial disclosures on the internet when I was working in the White House, and my colleagues were very angry at me. I got a lot of very angry calls about it, but respectfully, I think it's the right thing to do. That, however, is not the one I want to focus on. I want to focus on the function of putting all visitor records, every single visitor who comes to the White House, put on the internet, with a couple of very small exceptions, for example, for national security. It used to be that to get just a few of these records, 10 or 20 visitor records, you had to file litigation, and I know Italy knows something about slow litigation. It would take years to get the records. Now there are millions of these records that are on the internet. Any of you can go and look at them and see exactly who was visiting whom in the White House. Each of those records with about 20 basic categories of information: the name of the visitor, the person visited, the subject of the meeting, and so on. Why is that important? I began by referencing the Obama White House record in avoiding major scandal. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. First and foremost, the president's own integrity. The new code of conduct we put into place also had a part. But I think a very important part of that success story has been the fact that the records of all White House meetings go on the internet for everyone to see. That has allowed transparency. and the accountability transparency brings from the press, NGOs, civil society, and the public. That, in turn, has reinforced the code of conduct. So it is a virtuous cycle. It has discouraged people from having meetings that they shouldn't have. And if you don't have the meeting, you can't get in trouble for it. So it is not just a cure, but it is a prevention. And of course, that is the highest and best thing we hope for in these codes of conduct, is to prevent the problems from happening. So, to summarize, the U.S. view in one sentence, it's not even a full sentence: conflicts, gifts, employments, resources, enforcement, and above all, transparency. I look forward to discussing this further, and thanks again for inviting me to share the U.S. perspective. Grazie.
La pratica di registrare gli incontri anche.
I think the practice of recording meetings is also protection for members of parliament. I remember a case in Britain where a member of parliament managed to demonstrate that he'd not met someone because of a very clear record of all his meetings. So I now move on to Raffaele Cantone, who's the Italian head of the Italian Anti-Corruption Authority, and he's very well known in Italy. He is a member of the judiciary, and he combated the Casalesi gang, very well-known gang of criminals, very well-known because of Saviano's book called Gomorra. It's not exactly his field, code of conduct for members of parliament. It'd be interesting to see what his opinion is. Also because there was a bit of an argument recently on codes of ethics for members of parliament. Thank you, President. I'll try and respond to your question, which is a little provocative. I'll try and say something about it. I'd like to thank President Boldrini for having given me the opportunity to speak to you. We do have responsibility for codes of ethics, as I'll explain, codes of ethics for the public administration. But in particular, thank you for having spurred this discussion, because in my conclusion I'll be trying to say that the decision to set up a code of ethics is important not only symbolically but also in terms of practical results. And I also want to thank President Verso, even though she's left, through President Nicoletti. I met her recently in Strasbourg, and I saw that she is paying a lot of attention to the progress which is being made in Italy currently, and also considerable appreciation, which one rarely sees in European institutions, where often Italy is seen in a very unilateral and caricatured way. But thanks to the Council of Europe and thanks to the work of Mr. Nicoletti, a lot of attention is now being paid to what is being done in Italy. Now, before specifically coming to the topic of codes of ethics, I'd like to start from one other thing which you said previously, the issue of prevention, because we cannot understand the importance of codes of ethics unless we attempt to understand what the prevention of corruption means, what Italy has done in this area and what it has failed to do in the area of prevention of corruption. Because Italy, with a law, the Severino law, which President Boldrini mentioned, which was enacted in 2012, has provided itself with a set of rules for the prevention of corruption, a set of rules which have deployed or have attempted to deploy a number of antibodies which should try to prevent corruption. But these are, we must say, slow antibodies. They require long periods of time, and like other antibodies, they need to be accepted by the body in order to produce a reaction. What are the bases for our preventative system? Three, essentially: preventing the possibility of trying to bet on public administrations. It's not true that public administrations are only dens of people who misbehave or where dirty business is done. We need to really rely on the ability of public administration bodies to undertake self-reform, for example, by plans to prevent corruption. It's a long process, and I won't try to explain this because plans to prevent corruption are very interesting, useful to attacks some of the problems in public administration. Just to quote one figure in our results, finally it's been possible to attack situations which had affected our public administration, such as people remaining in their posts for years and decades even sometimes. So what is important is, which has been done, is to aim for transparency and the honesty of civil servants. Sometimes we complain about the fact that Italian laws aren't very good. I think that one of the law on transparency, Decree 33 of 2013, I think is one of the best laws there is, which has very significant provisions. Actually, you can say it's an improvement on the Freedom Act because it envisages that all public administration should have a website, and that in that website it should be possible to identify all the elements which identify the action of public administration, also the individuals making use of those actions. On the website of the region, we'll see the CV of the councillors, on the mayors, and the payment received or assets. Transparency is a fundamental key to combating corruption. It's a true way to combat corruption, because corruption, because of its nature, is something which is committed in the dark. It's something which needs to be concealed, whereas transparency stimulates the great antibody against corruption, which is the participation of citizens. You cannot imagine, I would have not been able to imagine before I took up this position, how many people monitor sites, websites, not just to spy on people or for gossip, because they really want to see whether the award of a contract has been given to someone who's provided all the requirements, and who report cases to us. Sometimes we're flooded with notices which we find difficult to manage. And the third point, which was stressed by the Severino law, is the honesty of civil servants. We've set up a very useful legislative instrument which does not solely envisage that people sentenced to jail will not be able to exercise hold public positions. Even someone sentenced in the first degree, I think this is quite justified, because this is not linked to the presumption of innocence. There's a need to protect the image of public administrations with the provision to identify conflicts of interest and rules governing incompatibility, and adopting a pantouflage system which doesn't make it possible to move easily from public to private. And this is something which is giving results, particularly provisions on transparency. And these are things which I hope will be looked at with greater interest on the part of international organizations, too. All too often focus on the flaws of Italy. There's a lot of there's a big debate on self-recycling, auto-recycling decree. Perhaps it could have been improved, this measure, certainly, but these aspects which are essential for the future battle against corruption, to these very little attention is paid. So I think major step forwards have been made, but there also are considerable deficiencies, and we need to be brave enough to say this to ourselves. And here the initiative of President Boldrini is heading in the right direction, because if we have a set of rules which is extremely useful, or which can be extremely useful in the public administration. We don't have an equivalent set of rules for corruption in politics. A lot of the rules which concern public administration, which apply to municipalities and regions and former provinces, don't apply to Parliament. And this is a limit. It was a political decision caused by the difficulty at that time of adopting more stringent provisions, because the laws adopted in 2012-2013 required considerable courage. And here too, we've made considerable steps forward. Decree 235, which is currently being actively debated, also known as the Severino Law, has major limits on the possibility of eligibility of candidates, and measures against people who have been sentenced to prison. We've seen that this is a law which can be applied and which is certainly improved the image of Italy considerably. But there are also major differences. If a administrator is sentenced for taking advantage of a position, he should be sentenced. And if a politician in the first degree is found guilty of corruption, nothing happens, because suspension doesn't apply to parliamentary activities. We have mechanisms of transparency which are very considerable for municipal and regional councillors, and these have to be expanded. I think that if we had these laws on transparency, events of the kind which we saw in the Lazio Regional Council would never have occurred, because it would have been difficult to think of making use of resources to buy personal assets, cars, or even sex toys, because you would have had to put them on the website, and therefore this wouldn't disclose them on the website, and this would not have been possible. For the time being, these laws don't apply to our members of Parliament. Now, I want to say, I'll be coming to this point. This is the right type of approach, and this is logical too, because paradoxically often we think that these mechanisms may further incentivize. It's said that an excess of transparency may fuel gossip rather than actual transparency. Instead, I think that the major step forward, what the European institutions are really waiting for, would be to extend the rules to prevent corruption to the national political system too. The President of the Chamber of Deputies, and I agree, said that it would be an outstanding result if we were capable of adopting a law on lobbying. And it would be even more important if we were able to establish a mechanism of true transparency for the funding of parties, and also those structures which have replaced parties, because we know that party life no longer takes place within parties themselves, but within other associations and foundations. But allow me to say, Mr. Chairman, that it would be a major step forward to adopt a code of ethics. Italy has made major steps forward in this area. Not enough, but for example, the Law 190 of 2012, the Severino Law, establishes a rule which would have been unthinkable 4 or 5 years ago, namely that codes of ethics become fully fledged legal provisions, which the infringement of which is subject to penalties. It's a Copernican revolution, and it's difficult to apply these, particularly when codes of ethics, and we heard this said by our eminent international guests, are made to descend from above, when the codes of ethics are approved without anybody actually reading their content. If codes of ethics are approved through a real consultation, if codes of ethics are not long statements of principle, but but have contain very clear principles, codes of ethics really work. They really work for at least one reason, which, namely that one can ask for an explanation of the conduct, and one can ask for the explanation of the conduct even independently of penalty. I don't think that a member of Parliament can be too worried by a penalty, whether it's disciplinary or monetary. It's good to have them, but I think that we need to consider a system which has a major impact in common law systems, sanctions which apply to people's reputation, identifying a conduct which not that you're fingered and made a laughing stock or made a highlighted before the public opinion to be jeered at, but so that your position is clear to public opinion. Now, I've appreciated your positions, Mr. Chairman, and they're important because through codes of ethics you can already reach out to some things. For example, 2B, which provision 2B, which refers to the responsibility of financial measures, introduces transparency without a specific law and can introduce a mechanism which is also a mechanism to avoid lobbying activities. It's not a bad word, lobbying. It's a bad lobbying is something bad when it's done in the dark, not when it's done in public. And I would conclude by saying that if we truly want to believe in the battle against corruption, not as a statement of principle, but as an actual fact, if we truly want to believe in the possibility for Italy to change in these areas, as in others, we shouldn't just adopt a code of ethics simply because the Council of Europe is asking us to do so. We shouldn't approve the code of ethics because Greco is asking for it. Obviously, it's very good for them to demand that we do, but because we need to consider this a true requirement which will really allow our members of Parliament to hold their heads high, because there are outstanding people in Parliament who do an excellent job and who I believe are the first people who have an interest of not being identified in these generic and dangerous indications according to which Parliament is full of criminals. The Code of Ethics is a way to move out of this situation of ambiguity too. Thank you.
Ringrazio il Presidente Cantone.
I'd like to thank Mr. Cantone for having reminded us that the best monitor of this area is public opinion, and for having made this explicit reference to the issue of transparency. And it's significant that we have Victor Alvino. He was president of Open Policy, which is an association which promotes public transparency, and it helps people to access data. This is the kind of battle which can't be conducted without the public opinion and the type of organization which can be made use of through associations, for example.
Perché, scusate, abbiamo la possibilità di avere un confronto.
We have the possibility of having international exchange here. Open policy is something which elsewhere is called a watchdog. This is typical positive lobbying organization. In the United States, this is still called a lobbying. Well, it's a lobbying organization working for transparency and working for collective interest. What I think sets us apart is the fact that we've been working using public data from the outset. We thought that working on information in Italy particularly could be effective if we managed to do something different compared with the traditional way of using information. So starting from data, public data, so as to make them available to citizens and spur a public debate by using the major advantages of internet technology. What I would like to say, however, is since that we're in an international context, I'd like to start from by trying to establish the context and give you some indications of what, in our opinion, are the distinctive traits of the political and institutional changes which we've been seeing in Italy over the last 2 or 3 years. So where are we now? We've used available data to provide a summary. The first thing I'd like to focus on is the fact that who is it who actually makes laws in Italy? Under the Constitution, it said that the legislative function is entrusted to Parliament, but in recent years, and increasingly in the last decade, the last 2 parliaments, this is becoming increasingly untrue. The data, and I'm not sure these data are visible to everybody, so I'll summarize them, tell us that parliamentary initiative, which leads to law, was less than 1% in the previous parliament. It's less than 0.50% in this parliament. So the actual people who make laws are not members of parliament, but members of the government, and so you can see a percentage of 25 to 33%, 0.5% for members of parliament. Laws which are increasingly presented by government. So there's an increasing role of the executive, which are approved increasingly, enacted increasingly by votes of confidence, which should be an extraordinary measure. Have you seen the results of votes of confidence in this parliament? In recent parliaments has increased enormously. So increasingly Parliament is reduced to the role of a notary, to someone who sees bills passed to them which need to be enacted very rapidly, so without the possibility of a true debate. But in Parliament we also see that there are very few people who have an effective role. We've, based on the data of the Chamber and the Senate, we've developed what we call an index of parliamentary productivity, which gives an assessment of which MPs are effective in their work. When we say effective, we see managing to have their initiatives come to fruition, whether there are bills or questions in Parliament. And from our survey, we see that more than 80% of members of Parliament in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate have very low productivity levels. Almost saying 0 to 80% productivity, it means that's practically nothing. They end up doing very little, and all the activity, all parliamentary productivity hinges on an oligarchy. This is the title we've given this slide, oligarchy. There's a very close-knit oligarchy in Parliament which makes use of all the powers and all the authority, and there is a countless plebs, 80% of Parliament, of representative citizens, have very little, a very reduced role, basically just voting on government initiatives. What's happening in the meantime? What's happening in party and political processes? Raffaele Cantone was saying previously that one important part of political activity is not carried out in parties, but parties in Italy exploded because the party system is subject to sources of change, but also because inside the parties, in the last 5 or 6 years, we're seeing this phenomenon which has very little to do with Anglo-Saxon think tanks. They're not places where people are developing innovative theories. What we got now are foundations, called foundations, and often they're places of where personal power is exercised within parties and sometimes against traditional parties, and which allow people to avoid transparency rules and public funding for parties. So not only can we say that parties no longer exist as in the past, we don't have parliamentary groups as we did in the past. Here we are talking about figures which speak of people moving from one group to another. In the last parliament there are more than 200 people moving from their parliamentary group, in which the one in which they were elected, to move to another group. A lot of members of parliament have changed two times, 3 times, 4 times, up to 6 times, and in the current parliament we've already beaten the record of the previous parliament. We've already gone beyond 200 group changes halfway through parliament, and there's a huge increase in groups, and there's a lot of turnover of members of parliament in these groups. So if this is the context, these are just suggestions. In this area where there is a crisis of in the traditional way of doing politics and representing electors, traditional institutions, traditional fora in which politics was exercised, and where there was supervision of political representatives, have now disappeared to a large extent, and this may be one of the reasons why there's the corruption is so intense, probably because of a weakening in the role of members of parliament. Individual members of parliament feel themselves bereft of any control, and therefore they have fewer ethical or political constraints, and therefore the effectiveness of regulatory measures or codes of ethics has to be placed within this kind of context. We believe that there are specific points which are typical of the Italian parliamentary system, which we can work on, and in particular where we can work on the relationship between electors and elected representatives. Accountability is the key here, being able to check the work of parliamentarians and see whether there's any consistency to the pledges made during the election campaign and what members of parliament actually do in parliament. The most important part of quantitatively of parliamentary work takes place in parliamentary committees. The data show us that most sessions, most time spent by MPs is in committee sessions. Now, we for years, since the previous legislation, have been trying to achieve full transparency in committee proceedings, and this does not exist because the regulations of Chamber of Deputies and the Senate define these proceedings as non-public. Publicity only applies to debates in the chamber, but as we know, laws are cooked in committees, and using this metaphor, the recipe with which this food is prepared is not known. We don't know who attends committee meetings. We don't know what they vote, because the voting of members of parliament in committees generally is not accessible, and we only partially know what is discussed. So an initial fundamental reform to reconstitute a healthy relationship between electors and elected people, to have true accountability, is to allow anybody, in particular electors, to know what they're voting, what their representatives, how their representatives vote, and to define a basic rule which is vote by roll call in committees and in the plenary chamber, so that electronic voting should take place in a way that makes it possible to understand who's voted for what, at least in the most significant stages, when you have the final vote on a law and when you have approval on an article-by-article basis. You're talking about the chamber or in committees? Not when you're voting on an article-by-article basis. That's not obligatory. So when you vote on article-by-article basis, which is a fundamental political decision, there's no obligation to have electronic voting. Well, there is, but it's not a rule which is defined. I'm sorry, but we can't hear the comments on the other side. We can only hear what the speaker is saying and not the objections which are being raised, because the microphone is not on. The people who count votes in this country, who knows most about them, are us, because actually, well, I think members of parliament also know a lot about how things take place in committees. No, I'm saying this is particularly important because there are continual debates in this country where political representatives attack their opponents because of provisions which they themselves have voted for. It's often happened that we entered into this debate saying, you're now attacking your opponents, but last year you voted for this law. And this makes discussions a lot clearer, and factual data come into play. When, for example, the confidence vote is taken, confidence vote is secret. But it's not done by roll call. I'm sorry, but the confidence vote is by roll call. Yes, no, abstained is indicated. This is public. It's public, but it's not electronic. But it is. It's recorded. We call the name comes up on the board, and the member of parliament says yes or no. And how can you be more public than that? Now, I want to specify this because we really can't. There shouldn't be any understanding on this. Confidence vote is public, but it's not electronic. That means that the information can't be accessed electronically. That means no. It's not in the record. In the records, the votes aren't recorded. So if one wants to transform this into electronic format, has to transfer this data from paper or PDF into electronic format, into a spreadsheet format. Yes, but there's work to be done in order to do that. You have to do a lot of processing. I apologize, but most of the comments, all the comments are being made with no microphone. Yes, streaming, that's video. That's interesting. So transparency today is something which is data-driven, and transparency is something which is driven by open data in our country. And we'll go to our requests. There are a lot of public data. For example, declarations of assets held are public data, but they're not open. So for our 1,000 members of parliament, we found the declarations which are available on the website of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. But these data are available on the websites of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. But these aren't data which is computer processable. So you got PDF and image declarations, and to translate this into data you can compute and process, you have to do a huge amount of work. That is why it is essential to translate documents and information into open data. Yes. This is the job of institutions. It's something which this country has committed itself to do. We belong to the Open Governance Partnership, which required from our institutions that data be published in open format. Mr. Cantone knows that the transparency decree is only partially implemented in Italy because we do have the transparent sections in local authorities, but often these websites are empty. They don't have data in open format, so this means that the actual publicity of this data is non-existent because you have to do so much work to translate this information into data and knowledge that basically the publicity is very, very restricted. And that's why we not only want the proceedings of committees to be public, and that electronic voting in committees and chambers be made necessary. We have to stop having people raising hands, otherwise it's very difficult to report to our population what people are voting for. But all the data from the Chamber and the Senate, including expenses data, need to be in enormous open format. The assets, the income of members of Parliament should be dealt with in this way. It's about 1,000 members of Parliament. In order to obtain any thing of use from these records, you have to have a large number of people working it, so it's very difficult to make use of this information. And we also like to say that the Chamber of Deputies by law collects data on private funding, and this should also be in open formats, and there should be in open formats which are usable for the expenses of parliamentary groups. So I'll be coming back again saying that information transparency today is something which can be done using transparency, network transparency, in order to make these processes possible. It's important for the data to be open, and we'd like to ask Parliament to ensure this.
Grazie Vittorio Alvino. E ora...
Thank you, Vittorio Alvino. I would suggest that we now hear out Michele Nicoletti, chairperson of the Italian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly, and also the drafter of one of the proposals, the two proposals to change the rules of procedure or the ethics code of the Italian Parliament. So I give you the floor. Thank you very much. And I would certainly like to thank Madame Boldrini, and thank you to the Council of Europe also for having jointly organized this meeting, an important initiative, an opportunity for exchanges, and a good example of cooperation among different parliaments. Cooperation that we wanted to engage in, that we very much value, because we wanted to bring our institutions more in line with European values. And I think this is a good example of Europeanization, if you will. I think that it's been very useful to have experts contributing to this debate, not only from Europe, but also our American expert. 2 years ago, we started to work on this new legislation, and at the time, we saw this almost in caricature terms. I mean, We once saw a cartoon where someone is saying, this school is more corrupt than the Italian parliament. So that was an American cartoon which raised the Italian parliament up to a sort of a symbol, an emblem of the height of corruption. I hope that not everyone perceives the Italian parliament in those terms. I mean, we don't always work in corrupt ways in the Italian parliament, contrary to what some might wish. But I think it's important to hark back to what was said by the last speaker. There is a crisis of democratically elected representative institutions, and this is due to a whole series of phenomena. Phenomena also associated with the fact that parliaments are losing power. That's a reality. International organizations are playing a more important role. Governments are playing a more important role, taking more and more initiatives. This is sometimes not entirely in line with the Constitution, but after all, there is Article 51 of the Constitution that allows the government to have these initiatives. Initiative of legislation is one of the prerogatives of the government, although not the drafting or enactment of that legislation. So there is a sort of a change in the way representative democracy is functioning and is perceived. And there is a debate in France about the ability of representative institutions to represent complex and diverse societies, because our societies are more and more complex and diverse. So this has given rise sometimes to corruption, to bad habits, and unfortunately in Italy the political class has not been entirely innocent in this regard. And I'm fully convinced, as has been said very clearly on previous occasions, that we need to approach this polymorphously. And a deontology code or a professional ethics code is one way of approaching the problem, of tackling the problem, but we also need appropriate legislation. And I was very pleased to hear President Cantone paint the Italian picture with so much clarity, because it is a situation in which we have, in fact, endowed ourselves with legislation that is pioneering. It's one of the best enactments in the world. It could no doubt still be further improved, but it is one of the best. But for this really to work, then we need the political classes to play the game. And in Italy, it's really an issue of training of political leaders, and I think that is crucial. I think they need to be properly educated, and that applies not only to the political class, but also to teachers, university professors, leaders of public institutions, directors of public institutions. We are therefore working on laws governing the training, selection, and appointment of decision makers, and that is something that politics can contribute to. We need to rebuild the system that is used to train these people before they become decision makers. I mean, personal morality, laws, codes, none of this can stand in for the crucial role of the legislator, and I think that's the Achilles heel about which we need to think in connection with international integration. And then, of course, there's the role of civil society, of public opinion. They can play a very important role as well. So we need a very strong civic ethics, and here I would agree with President Boldrini. It's not a question of moralizing. I mean, if you are familiar with the tradition of constitutionalism, we know that a constituent part of any constitutional democracy is ethics in public life. I mean, Montesquieu was one of the first to say this, and I turn here to our French colleagues. Our American colleague also mentioned this long-standing tradition of the Republic. It is a founding pillar of morality, but it's not just a question of political morality, it's a question of the morality of the body politic as a whole. Those who are called upon to hold public office at any time in their lives need to be imbued with that spirit. And so I think we need to redouble our efforts, and it is in that connection that we are proposing this professional ethics code. And I think that if we look at Articles 54 and 67 of the Italian Constitution, they do remind people of the need to act in an honorable manner. And these must not just be pious wishes. These are articles in the Constitution, and therefore they need to be reflected in legislation. And so our professional ethics code is an important, we always use the term deontology in French rather than a code of good behavior. Well, I'm convinced that a code of good behavior should fill in the space between legality on the one hand and personal morality on the other. So a professional ethics or a deontology code has a certain important role to play. For instance, what about the medical profession with the Hippocrates Oath? I mean, that is a very clear professional ethics code without which it would not be possible for a patient and the person who treats them to trust one another. If the patient does not have the certainty that the medical expert whom he trusts is really going to follow his oath, well, he wouldn't trust him. And in Article 54, there is a reference to a solemn undertaking, a solemn commitment. And it is a question of an individual who, at a time when that person occupies a public office, the person commits her or himself in very formal terms. And for there to be any trust, that must not be dubitable. And it is in this uncertain space between legality and morality that you find the importance of professional ethics or deontology. And the first offender must be the social body as a whole, as in the case of doctors. I mean, they are the ones who have the greatest interest in protecting the reputation of the members of the medical profession on the one hand, and we as politicians of the political profession on another. So I think that the time really has come to fill in that space between legality and morality. Now, various themes have been touched upon in the course of the discussions that we've had, but let me just remind you of a proposal that was included in previous legislation. Paola Benetti was the drafter of that, and in the course of this session, another proposal has been tabled by myself, co-signed by 164 other members of Parliament, and the idea is to remind us all of principles that are important, that are crucial for each individual parliamentarian, which must inspire all of one's activity. And it's not just a question of avoiding conflict of interest, of being transparent, or other such principles. It's really a question of the parliamentarian being personally rigorous with respect to the way he takes the floor individually, in public, or in the hemicycle. And of course, the principles of the Council of Europe relate to that. There is speech ethics, which is part of a public office holder's ethics as well. One should avoid using certain terms that should not, in fact, be used in the public domain. And then insofar as transparency, avoiding conflict of interest, and especially financial interest, I would like to say the following. I can understand what open police is calling for, but you need to make a distinction between access to data, publicity of data on the one hand, and the possibility of processing these data. If I submit to the Bureau of the Chamber of Deputies in Italy a PDF file, the Chamber of Deputies is supposed to subsequently spreadsheet? No, I mean, a lot has already been done under the rules that govern us to ensure transparency, but transmission of files in a way that is technically easable? Well, I mean, for analysts, for formatters, that might simplify things, but we shouldn't have additional burdens put on our shoulders as a political class. It's not a question of hiding anything, it's a question of revealing information in a given form. If someone wants to put it in another form, they can do that. But let me remind you of one other subject, which is more urgent in nature. There are some urgent natures to be taken. Within the European Italian Parliament, we have started to take up an important and quite difficult and urgent task, namely the constitution that doesn't necessarily have an impact on the way our chambers function. There we turn more to the rules of procedure, because they too will have to be changed once the constitution is changed. The rules of procedure will have to be reformed, that goes without saying. But this subject of a deontological code is not something that relates exclusively to the rules of procedure, the modus operandi of the two chambers. No, this code will be an instrument that will provide politicians and citizens an assurance that the quality of the work of the citizens' representatives will be improved. And I very much hope that this seminar will end up being a sort of an invitation to the political class, to individual politicians, and let us all put everything else aside. Let us give a clear impetus and send a clear message to our citizens and to international organizations, showing that the Parliament can also play its role. And I think that this is something that has been recalled by a number already. Parliamentarians who do their work seriously and not corruptly have the right to have this kind of instrument that would be worthy of the exercise of their functions and that would distinguish them from more negative action that is reproached by many. So those who acquit themselves in a professional manner and dignified manner of their task should, for the good of the Republic, be the ones who really stand for the Parliament. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Nicoletti. Thank you for having mentioned political parties. Obviously, the reform of politics must also be based on reform within political parties, political foundations. They also play an important role, I would say even a crucial one, because they represent a sort of a link or a bridge, if you will, between the citizens. Yes, I see the gentleman would like to take the floor. I would call upon you to be as concise as possible so that we can take as many speakers as we can. And please introduce yourselves before taking the floor.
Before moving to the discussion, I'd also like to clarify something in the discussion we had when a description of how the Chamber of Deputies functions was made. I really want to make it clear so that there's no misunderstanding that in the report, when there is a confidence vote, the tabulated records are indicated. There's name and surname of the way the person has voted. So it's really can't get more public than that. And there's one specific point I'd like to Mr. Alvino spoke of the level of productivity of members of Parliament. I don't think that it is right to refer level of productivity only to the outcome of provisions, because there are lots of members of Parliament who work on bills and provisions who may not actually end up being enacted, but which are important. Often the opposition members see their proposals rejected, but that doesn't mean they're not working effectively. Doesn't mean that members of Parliament who don't lead to actual provisions are lazy. I think that opens up a misunderstanding. Either I misunderstood you, or if I have, perhaps you could clarify this, because I can understand level of productivity in terms of presence, number of hours in committee, number of hours in chamber. You know that in this parliament, all the indicators for amount of work have increased. Number of hours in chamber, in committees, presence of MPs. So if we want to give a full picture to public opinion, we also have to highlight these aspects. Otherwise, it might seem that, what, 5% of MPs are actually working and all the others are just twiddling their thumbs. It's not true. It's either I misunderstood you, or and if I have, maybe you should specify this point. Shall I do that now, or shall we wait? As you want, but it's something which struck me. Now, our index of parliamentary productivity clearly takes into account the possibility that the probability of an opposition representative having his proposals enacted, and he gets double points attributed to him or her compared to someone in the majority. And in our productivity indexes, it's actually people in the opposition who are top ranked. So the differences in the probability of a proposal coming to fruition is taken into account. We don't just take into account the outcome of the proposal, but also the participation on the part of members of parliament and the time they spend their attendance. We make a distinction between ordinary votes and final votes. So we do take into account all the information. And I truly acknowledge that the Chamber of Deputies and Senate make available a huge amount of information on this. So we're the first to recognize that this is very good practice internationally. The open data made available by Chamber of Deputies and Senate are among the most advanced. We also have developed smartphone apps so that the Parliament's open data is available. We always say this, and I will emphasize that here too. What we're saying is that there's an important part of parliamentary work which is carried out in committees, and it's important for there to be light on that, so that we have data to have even more thorough data, so that we can truly appreciate the amount of work which is carried out by members of parliament. And using these data and using a productivity index, what we find out that people rank top, and not the members of parliament who are always on TV. Often there are people who are less known to public opinion. And if we develop the real data, we can truly show the differences. And so the more data we have, the better we can portray this situation, and we can show public opinion things which will, I think, lead them away from anti-politics. Thank you. Let's not reduce the productivity index of the conference, because if we spend too much time on this point, we might. So please. Yes. Many thanks. Can you give me your name and your affiliation? Talio Diaz is my surname. My mother's called Tejera. I'm a Spanish senator. I like this kind of spontaneous discussion, because before there's a sense of protocol, and you have to put a jacket on to go to the toilet. I find that a bit rigid, and I prefer this spontaneity of people from the south. It's something which I really like. And question is to Raffaele Cantone, but since he's not here, I'll ask my friend Michele if I'm not bothering him, and so I'll have an opportunity to listen to what he's saying here, because I'm very interested in this matter of public ethics. This is the question. Two articles of Constitution, 5467 with the law 190 2012 and the Severino law, two decrees, 33 2013 and 235. I don't know what year, I think it's 2015, but I missed that date. My question is, if we're speaking of corruption, that's a part of the crisis of parliamentary democracy. That's a component, it's not the whole story. My question is, since law doesn't change life, it's a result. It comes from the consensus of civil society. My question is, what other thing different from law can people do, if people working in public affairs can do? What can we do apart from laws as people working in the public realm? The whole concept of prevention, because I really like what Cantoni was saying as a legal expert, because it's very concrete. He speaks of real things. But the question is the following: what can we do, particularly inside our political parties? Inside political parties, as an example for society? That is a question, dear President Laura Boldrini, and I thank you for a president of delegation like Nicoletti. Congratulations on having him. Machinaro asks for the floor. No. So we have first Senator Oriana. First of all, I wanted to flag the fact that in the ranking of productivity index at Open Polis, I'm 15th. So I'm certainly not complaining about their monitoring, even though I don't agree with quite a lot of the statements from Mr. Alvino. But I'd like to come to the point. With regard to lobbying, I presented a bill in Senate, and this law was then chosen as the basic text. So in the Senate, my basic text will be discussed. I'm very glad and proud of this. And I did this despite my lack of experience. This is my first term in Parliament. I realized that this was essential. Relations with all those people who have all those interests, sometimes direct interests, companies, but there are also people who represent other interests. These activities, which should not be equated automatically with corruption, because if it's something which should be regulated, and we need to bring this all to light. And the goal of my bill is transparency, to know who these people are. For us as members of Parliament too, because often we talk to people and we don't know in what capacity they're present. Maybe you just talk to them and then only later you discover what their activity is and who they're paid by, and we also need to provide transparency to citizens with regard to who we meet. So, for example, if we meet a certain association 100 times and another association we never meet, then our electors can discuss whether to vote for us again or not to vote for us again, also based on this information. And this is, and I think equality of access to lobbyists is also important, because there are lots of differences for them in terms of ease of access to offices. And so, not so much a question, but I was just saying that I think it's very important that this topic has now become part of the Italian political agenda, and I hope that the difficulties in the slowness of procedure in Parliament, we know it's due to our system, will lead to fruition. Lord Anderson.
Lord Anderson, sorry about that.
After 40 years in Parliament, I am highly, highly skeptical of productivity indexes. Those who are insiders in Parliament know who are the effective parliamentarians. The press and outsiders, whatever mathematical models they try to have, do not know who are the effective parliamentarians. Second point, that we've had from our panelists a wonderful reservoir of expertise. I hope they will make that expertise available to FIFA. And third and last point, what are the limits, the proportionality of disclosure? For example, if my wife, my partner, has a gift or a job, if my children have a gift or a job, that is as possible to be a matter of corruption. Where where do we draw the line in terms of the reach, the limits of our inquiries?
Grazie.
Thank you. Ms. Binetti has the floor. Thank you very much for this opportunity, to discuss matters internationally, which allows us to appreciate positions which sometimes are different and sometimes are in advance of what we have in our country. What I wanted to say in reference to what Mr. Nicoletti was saying is that in practice, under 4 governments, I have tabled the possibility of discussing a code of ethics. I'm a physician, so I'm really, it's something which is close to my heart, code of conduct, not just the Hippocratic Oath. But this has never been possible. There is a cultural resistance to discussing this. And here we're running the risk of this just being a intellectual exercise where we can just discuss various experiences. Luckily, the experiences which have been outlined are very different and shows that different decisions are available on the type of model, but I don't think that we can avoid bringing this debate into Parliament. It's something which I'm saying directly to President Poltrini. This is something which has to be addressed by Parliament. And you know that as soon as you have scheduled the timing for motions presented, automatically you have proposals from groups, and I find this is effective because there's no right of primogeniture, but this socializes the debate. So I'd like to ask President Poltrini, before such an eminent assembly, to make this commitment. And secondly, since you have a friend, a colleague, a senator, Antonio Polito, next to you, someone with whom we worked together when the discussion began, and when there was an awareness that the Italian crisis was not just economic, but first and foremost a crisis of ethics and public ethics. I wanted to say that the media, the press, are not always objective in covering situations of difficulty. Often they're really just trying to cover everybody with mud. And I think it is important to report on scandals and faulty behavior. But I think that in the same way, you should also outline good practices so that citizens can make their minds up about politicians and parties based on real facts. We've reached a very, very dangerous index in the recent recent elections. We're only just about 50% in voter turnout. And if we go beyond 50%, and if we do that because of the image of the political world and the credibility of the political world, and also for the possibility of identifying the tumor but not identifying the subject with the tumor, I think that democracy will really be in jeopardy. On the other hand, I think that a combination of intense internal debate on ethics supported by the media could really reconcile citizens with politics. Thank you.
Non negherò che ci sono.
I won't deny that there are cases where there's an excess of lack of responsibility in the Italian media. Yes, I just want to answer Ms. Binetti to say that I'll be writing to all group leaders on this subject and to all members on the board for the rules, because I realize this is a crucial element. I organized this meeting so that we could focus on this, unfortunately, at a time when this is an issue of great moment, and we saw this, what happened early this morning at dawn. So I am fully committed to this. With Michele, we've long been talking about the importance of having this initiative with the Council of Europe, and this initiative is targeted to concrete results. I'm not saying we want to do this, we must do this, and so I'll be writing to group leaders and the members of the board on regulation so that a code of ethics will be adopted as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Benito.
Very much. I will try to be very short because this is such a complicated matter and we just probably touch some of the issues, but of course this will bring us very far. I think that at the matter of this topic is the issue of representation and the crisis of representation, meaning, of course, a parliamentarian is representing people, interests, positions. I mean, representation and lobbying has something to do. What I try to say is that we are in the midst of a discussion in which the political representation is being put as something completely under suspicion. Anything which has to do with the parliament and with political representation is now under suspicion. And if we continue to give in which are some basic tenets of the political representation, ones were evocated by Michele Nicoletti before, an ethos of the profession, but also this idea of political representation, and that includes positions and opinions and interests, because we are not living in an abstract world. If we continue to give in, this is just arguments for the populists. And I think the attack on the parliament now is extremely grave, extremely severe. And all our parliaments are just in the middle of this discussion. How long should it go, the disclosure? And Lord Anderson was very clear on that. The disclosure on anything, you know, lives, professional activities, financial biographies, activities of the spouses, of the children, of the grandchildren. I mean, there is a moment in which parliamentarians have to be also able to say, you know, I am a representative and I have a dignity. And when somebody or some groups, and I understand fully the criticisms, and of course there were a lot of mistakes, but when somebody talks about productivity of the parliamentarians, I'm just telling you a simple example. We Spanish parliamentarians are here today. It's a holiday in Spain. We are members of the Council of Europe. We are not getting any honoraries because being a members of the Council of Europe, and we are working. I mean, just to say, and this nobody knows. Nobody knows. So I think it is important that parliamentarians all around Europe get out and tell very often the things as they are. I am not speaking as a member of the political class. I came to Parliament in the last 3 years, coming from the university, as Michele, we knew each other from university before, and from the profession. And I must say, parliamentarians are just giving in. I understand the criticisms. We must to be transparent, but there are some limits. And Lord Anderson said that much better than I do. But I'm exactly on his same mood. Things have to be clear, but please don't give up to populists. Thank you.
Professore Benito, io la ringrazio molto.
Professor Benito, I thank you very much for having said these words and for having stressed that the work of members of Parliament takes place inside Parliament and outside Parliament as well. It's in your local constituency, it's taking part in international events. We all work outside our working hours in Parliament, and many people like you, I'm speaking for myself, I've been in this position for 2.5 years, and for 25 years I did another job, so I don't have to defend the category of politicians because I don't think I belong to it yet after 2 years and 3 months. But I live the institution from the inside, and I see the deficiencies, but also the importance of the institution. And I really think that it is important to understand how much is done inside here. A lot of people inside here work well and do work hard with great enthusiasm. And this is something which is never reported to the public opinion. And people are never told that people come here on Monday, they leave on Thursday, and then Friday they have initiatives, on Saturday and Sunday they always got other business to attend to. This is not something which is never recognized, and it's not right. It's not right. And therefore I believe that if we want to have a balanced picture of what people do in this capacity, we have to include everything. Otherwise, we are concealing things. We're actually, instead of being transparent, we're actually concealing a part of the activities. And this is also not right. And so if we really want to be transparent, we have to be transparent fully. Mr. Mannino. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask a question, perhaps to complete the response to the President of Open Policy, because I agree with I appreciate the amount of work which is done in our Parliament, and I'm sure which is done in other parliaments. But I wanted to ask whether, since we have people representing a number of countries here, whether the finding that most parliamentary work is carried out in committees also applies to other countries. I'm saying this because inside our parliament, parliamentary committees, and there are 14 in our parliament, of these, not all of them have their proceedings recorded or webcast. But in particular, inside committees, there's not, we don't have electronic voting in the chamber. In plenary, it is done, which electronically, and is recorded in electronic form. So, I was wondering whether in other countries committee work is also prevalent, because in our system we can develop laws inside committees without actually going to the plenary chamber. So I'd like to know whether this corresponds to the situation in other countries, and whether their working committees is recorded by video and recorded fully. Ms. Leclerc had asked for the floor.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few simple points because Mr. Nicoletti has opened the door with a quote from Montesquieu, and you can find everything you need to know about deontology and professional ethics there. He says that the founding principle, the essential founding principle of democracy is political virtue. And he distinguishes the honor due to the monarchy from political virtue. And that's a sort of a coin with two sides to it. I mean, it's a bit old now as an analogy, but I think it's still interesting. I mean, the first one is that you renounce your own interest. And I would agree with what Lord Anderson and the Spanish deputy has said. I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm a university professor, a professor of law, but I do observe what politicians do. And for those who really do their work well, there's a sort of a renunciation of themselves, of their own interest. So political virtue is based on that, and that is a burden for political leaders. But for Montesquieu, political virtue also involves an interest in virtue. That's the other side of the same coin. What does that mean in practical terms? For political virtue to function in practice, it is necessary that the agents involved in that political activity have an interest in it. And when you observe private companies, for instance, that very commonly today, I mean, it's been done in the United States for some time, but in France for the last 10 years or so, companies, large companies that are listed on the stock exchange are all providing themselves with codes of ethics and the means to ensure that they are followed. And why are they doing this? Because today, to have a code of ethics in a large company, if it is effective, it makes it possible to combat corruption, and it is considered to represent some 8 to 10% of the stock exchange listing value of the company, and privately owned companies don't have them. And universities in France are also starting to provide themselves with codes of ethics because they are evaluated, ranked internationally by independent ranking agencies, and that gives them added value. So for the political class, for parliamentarians today, that's really the difficulty that arises. For some political agents, some of them are convinced, I mean the president and others, but the difficulty consists in making sure that all of them understand that virtue can be of interest to them in electoral terms or otherwise, and so that virtue will not necessarily weigh heavier than vice in the final outcome, but really the two efforts have to go together, to have a text, to have a code of ethics or a deontological code, but we must also convince the political class that it has an interest in being virtuous. It is in its interest to be virtuous. With the microphone, the moderator is speaking without a microphone, but he's giving the floor to someone and asking them to introduce themselves.
I don't have the cartolina. This is Jordi Xuclà, member of the Spanish Parliament, as well Catalan, has said Mr. Benito. And thank you for this session because it's a psychotherapeutic session, extremely productive for the parliamentarian around Europe here in Rome. Maybe something that we can say here is not easy to say in Madrid or in Barcelona, but I think that is extremely open-minded and useful, this kind of contact between these new movements from civil society in order to control and check and balance the political activities and our activities and our feelings in front of our job, in front of the mirror in the day today. Two comments. First one, I come back to Mr. Lord Anderson and Mr. Benito. Politics is not about statistics. Politics is about the quality of the deliberation, political deliberation, and the positive consequences of this kind of political deliberation in form of laws and political decisions. I am in Parliament for a little bit more than 3 years. Let me show how I can increase the statistics. If 4 times per year, I catch up all the items of the budget and I ask the government, execution of the budget in this item and this item and this item. And I repeat these questions 4 times per year. I can increase absolutely my activity, but I feel a lack of qualitative evaluation of the politicians in Parliament. I don't know if you know the newspaper Politico in Washington. This is a good example. I don't meet this kind of Politico in our countries. I want a qualitative evaluation about my job. I want people, journalists, political science actors who follow our activity in the Parliament, who can remember that Mr. Chukla, 3 years and a half ago, during your electoral campaign, you was very active in this matter. Where is this project of law? Where is the coherence between your speech and your activity? And this is about quality of our job. And there are a lack of, in this report between civil society and politicians, and lack of follow-up in journalists, because in times of Twitter, it's very easy to do a Twitter. It's much more complex to keep for 9 months a good law in a parliament. Sorry, and thank you for help in Rome, in the springtime, in this nice day.
Grazie. Oltre al deontologo.
Thank you. Alongside deontologists, I think we need psychologists. I was saying that we still have. I'd like to close the list of speakers so we can see who wants to take the floor still. Yes? Yes, we're going to have an answer from Michele. We just want to ask were there any further requests. There are 2 speakers now here, Michele, who has to give an answer. So we can close the list now. Alvino, Valetsky, and then we'll close with Michele Nicoletti. And then I'd like to say something too. Yes, I just wanted to specify. I'm very glad that a lot of points have been made on this issue. First of all, our productivity index is called Parliamentary Productivity Index, so it's limited to institutional work. And this is something which can be assessed if we have enough data. Obviously, work which isn't carried out inside the institutions is not computed in this index because it will become so vague. For example, reading a book might be classified as work, so then the whole thing becomes too discretional. Our productivity index is a system which we developed together with members of parliament. We didn't invent it on our own. We consulted dozens of members of parliament. We continue to consult them. It's still a work in progress, and we really take on board comments which come to us from people who work in this area, and in particular members of parliament. It's not strictly qualitative because we don't consider the quality of, we can't say whether a bill is right or wrong, good or bad, but we do take into consideration a lot of criteria and parameters which are available, and we are clear about the limits of this kind of instrument. We say it's an instrument which allows us to start to begin to understand differences between MPs, and we believe that information is the first antidote to anti-parliamentary feeling and populism. Using this instrument, with all its limits, we've brought a lot of people closer to understanding what happens in parliaments, what distinctions there are between one can make between different members of parliament. And we've seen that members of parliament who have a very low productivity index are also members of parliament who never turn up in parliament, because this is something which also needs to be said. There's quite a lot of members of parliament who do their job without being highlighted by the public opinion, but there's also there are a minority, luckily, of people who have very low productivity, which on a quality and quantity level is so low. Also because they're never in Parliament. There are a dozen members of Parliament or so whose attendance in Parliament is close to zero at votes. And so certainly you could make quality assessments on that. But if quality data allows you to understand things better. Sorry, the final objection. We're not asking for direct video coverage of committees. We're not interested in video coverage of committees. And when we speak of data, people are saying, what's the limit to transparency? I think the limit is the use and availability of data which have significance. And when we're speaking of data of this kind, we're speaking of voting records. We're just asking for voting records in committees to be public. We're not asking about people's nephews, nieces, or what people's wives are doing. Well, this discussion about productivity is interesting, but it doesn't overlap fully with the Code of Conduct. And they're two very different things. We've had this discussion because it was interesting, and we got a bit excited about this, but it's really not, it doesn't have much to do with the Code of Conduct.
Very briefly, and those are my personal comments as a former youth politician. I think that, just to finish on a positive note, I would also like to recognize that there are some positive trends which are taking place. And I think they will help us to actually reform our systems. Two very positive trends. One, which deals also when it comes to representation. I think it's changing the way we operate in politics is actually an enormous increase in terms of gender equality in parliaments. If we look at what was happening in '95, in our region, only 10% of parliamentarians were women. Today, 26.6% of women in the Council of Europe OSCE parliaments. We're privileged to have some parliaments with presidents women. It's still far from Beijing target of 30%, and if we progress with this speed, we will only reach gender parity in 50 years' time. But this is a positive development, and the way we operate as a politicians is changing because we're opening ourselves. So politics becomes more representative. Second very important development, which Norman was mentioning, I think it's the issue of transparency. No doubt, politics is much more transparent now than it used to be 20 years ago. And we don't have to be afraid of transparency. We just have to embrace it and work with the fact that most of the things which we'll be doing are going to be under scrutiny. There is no way we can stop this transparency growing, and we just have to acknowledge it. Third positive trend is, I think media are becoming more sophisticated. And Antonio, I would never get upset with journalists. Their role is to bring cases of corruption to a public attention. Sometimes this, would be done without actually looking at the personal consequences, but this is the very important thing. Actually, media and politicians are on the same boat. Both of them are benefiting from ethics and professionalism in public life. And I very much agree with what Professor Benito said. I am also a strong believer that the ruling of European Code of Human Rights, which talks about limited privacy protection of private life of politicians, yes, there is a limitation, but we should not allow for complete lack of protection of private life. And I am aware of at least few rulings of courts, including France, where actually courts are now recognizing that, yes, we have a limited protection, but we need to have some protection of a private life. So maybe another positive trend which we will see is that some courts will actually recognize that politicians deserve a certain level of protection when it comes to private life. And this is what I was trying to say in my presentation, that when you are designing such a system, you need to balance it vis-à-vis protection of privacy.
Grazie. Nicoletti.
Thank you, Nicoletti. I hadn't seen you.
Comment on the suggestion that FIFA can use our help. I volunteer, but only if I also get to play on one of the teams. I want to emphasize very quickly the extreme urgency of moving forward. We can feel the momentum in the room. Signor Presidente, I see how strongly you're leading on this, and one of the critical aspects of all of this, I alluded to it in my remarks, so did my colleague, we call it in the United States, tone at the top. Because the truth is that this whole system only works if the leaders of the system set a very strong tone. So I really applaud you and applaud all of you for your sense of urgency, and we all will be hoping for fast action on a code of conduct. I am very sensitive, since I myself am a public official, first working in the White House and then working in as ambassador. And all of my financial information and personal information and that of my family under our very strong U.S. transparency was put on the internet. And I got a lot of very impertinent questions. But what we have found in our use of transparency is when we embrace it, you're able to define a decent realm. If you're forward-leaning, you can define a realm of decency, and that enables you to limit the space where it becomes overly intrusive. That's number one. And number two, often before you do the transparency, which I think is a critical part of the code, as we talked about, a part of the enforcement, the natural enforcement. It creates an information market that allows official enforcement to be supplemented by the rest of society. The predictions are dire before you do the transparency. I remember we had a big debate in the White House about whether we can put these visitor records on the internet, and people said, we'll never be able to function. Well, now, it's 6 years later, it's a regular part of life. We're functioning just fine. So I think a reasonable transparency in the United States, we're very forward-leaning. We have a strong sense of public life. I think reasonable transparency should be embraced. That would be my contribution, my humble contribution to the vigorous debate. I loved the passionate debate here. That made me feel right at home. Thank you.
Grazie. Nicoletti, allora.
Thank you, Nicoletti, then. Thank you very much. I'd like to answer my colleague Arcadio, who's asking us what we still need alongside the Articles, Constitution and the laws he quoted. Just give you an example. Gifts. With regard to gifts, it might seem to be a minor issue, but it does explain what Fernand Milan was saying between the link between virtue and functioning. In the 1848 draft of the Italian Constitution, which was produced by Rosmini, a great philosopher, it was envisaged that if a member of parliament received a gift from a lector, he was immediately barred from his position in election, which was standing to say that that position was not that function was not a private interaction, but was public. And so the prohibition of gifts there is in the European Parliament, not being able to accept a gift up to 150 euros, forces me as a member of Parliament to remember in every instant that I am exercising a public function, not a private function, which requires financial intermediation or a service to this citizen, and that is something which is fundamental. I wouldn't put it in the Constitution, but I think it should find its place in the Code of Conduct. The perception in our country today is that if a public administrator or a member of parliament receives significant sizable gifts, is not that big. The code also provides people with a clearer perception of their role, and therefore also promotes an image of public morality, and perhaps that's something which can give a clear idea on the Code of Conduct. So I think we've now finished. If I can say something, because I was a member of Parliament in the past, and now I'm in the media, so I've seen things from both sides. And Benetti, who we worked together in the Senate, reminded me of this. One of the reasons why I found it difficult to continue as a member of parliament was what you've been speaking about, this very intense social pressure. I even stopped protesting against the injustices I had receiving because for example, when dealing with public administration, because people would then accuse me of trying to make use of my position as a member of parliament. It's much more comfortable to be on the other side, and it's much more fun to be in the media. But in part, the atmosphere of that, at the time, in Parliament, that atmosphere is justified because we really need to elevate the moral standard of our Parliament. It was too low compared to international standards. And in fact, I think we have elevated it with a number of measures and provisions. Second thing I want to say is that you shouldn't think that these provisions don't have any effect on public opinion, that this atmosphere can't be combated. Just to give you one thing, since someone's quoted the turnout to the regional elections, not many people have said that, whereas at the regional elections there's a 52% turnout. In the municipal elections there was a 65% turnout, which means that electors can distinguish what they're voting for, and they have a different judgment for the institutions which they deal with. And I also add that the Italian Parliament was also damaged by other institutions, not the Parliament itself, because in recent times corruption of politicians in actual fact has been much more intense in regional authorities than in the national parliament, and this is something which is just the plain truth. And a final thing to bear in mind, Senator Benetti was saying that Parliament resists groups and parties. The method of peer pressure, which is being experimented today, and it's something which derives from the pressure of the Council of Europe on member states trying to make them act in this way, is decisive, and it's something which also overcomes local resistance. I think that the commitment which the President of the Chamber, Boldrini, asked us to have a law on lobbying by the end of this Parliament, and the Code of Conduct for members of Parliament, is achievable and would be a very important outcome from today's meeting. If you agree, I think that we can now wind up. Thank you all.